Thanks very much, Brendan, and thanks to Imani. We've got about 35 minutes now for discussion, questions, comments, and so I'd just like to open up the floor. Liam, is it possible for people to send in comments and questions online as well? So we welcome those from everybody watching, whether you're in the room or you're watching online. So let me open up the floor now for comments, questions. You do? Okay.
Yep. We've got a question from Sherry Madazo Diamzon from the Philippines. She's a graduate student in development studies and says, the case study cited by Brendan and his insight that dignity is often set aside whenever the rush of humanitarian assistance is taking place in the context of a crisis is very true. Her question, integrating dignity in the process of giving protection was successful when they partnered with an organisation which has a network of organised communities. How does the manual or how can the approach be applied in situations where communities are not organised?
Look, I think I was asked this question several days ago, and I think back to a situation like the Darfur conflict where I worked, and one of the key things that you do notice where you're working in a conflict situation is that communities will organise themselves. They'll organise themselves relatively quickly, or you can facilitate them to organise themselves. But these structures emerge organically and naturally, just like they do in a family situation. And so, I'd counter the assumption that communities aren't organised. I think it's a question of finding out how they are organised and how they do organise themselves, and then trying to build on those responses. I think it's also, I mean, this is where it boils back to something that we talk a lot about in Palestine. It's the relationships, and so if you've got networks into a community and you build a strong, trustful and committed relationship with individuals and people, it's having those conversations with those people, trying to identify what dynamics within the community. If it appears not to be organised, is that because of certain conflict going on within the community? Are there rivalries and so forth? It takes a strong analysis of the community dynamics, and that would be the first step. I don't know, any...
Anything to add?
I don't know if anybody else has a different view or a view. I mean, I'm by in no sense an expert.
It'd be interesting to hear from some of you who may be engaged in similar work.
Can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
Go ahead and sort of jump on the back of that.
Do you want to just, if you could identify yourself, that would be great.
Sure, my name's Katrina Aitken. I currently work for Safer World as a conflict and security advisor, particularly looking at sort of issues around community security and what that looks like. I think this has been really helpful in sort of raising a number of questions, and it's quite interesting how it plays on what has been happening for quite a long time around sort of community-based development and participation, how it highlights many of the issues around sort of the professionalisation of care and how very much the international community coming in and the way that it has can be quite damaging. I guess one of the issues that I'm particularly interested in highlighting this question around how protection has tended to focus on state actors and non-state actors. I think we oftentimes kind of look at them as very separate entities, and perhaps create sometimes false or artificial divisions between sort of those community non-state actors and state actors. And I guess one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how do we work with local communities in the ways that you've described or begun to describe, but to really encourage and equip them to become real agents of change at those higher levels, at whether they be with non-state actors or even with state actors. I was struck that there was a quote in the film that just said, we need international pressure to end the siege on Gaza. And yes, of course, that's true. But then do they have a place in that as well? And I guess where is their lobbying role amidst not just sort of the service role at that local level, but at a higher level?
I'm happy to answer it.
Well, I thank you. One of the, in my mind, one of the issues of working with local communities, I mean, and it's very contextual and very varied, but in contexts where communities are not, I mean, never mind the crisis, never mind the disaster situation. Without a disaster situation, I've been in villages in the Middle East where there's no disaster situation, just ask people, what would you like the government to do? There is no healthcare facilities, there is no sewage system, there is nothing. And the only consistent answer is leave us alone. So when we are in a context where the unspoken contract between state actors and the non-state actors who are also quite alien, they are the either chattering classes or the educated, and the only connection is that we at best peacefully coexist. It is very challenging, really, to expect that communities will suddenly become politically, as we know it, as a very particularly Western incarnation of politically active, will go and vote. No, they won't. And again, that's why I think one of the challenges that the paper speaks of is that, yes, we will be creating these new engagements and new structures. And in itself, this can be very challenging and very threatening, even to the communities themselves, because a lot of the time we're pushing them out of their comfort zones. I come from a community where, no, thank you very much, we don't want to engage. Historically, our engagement with state and non-state actors has been absolutely catastrophic. We don't want to engage. And when organizations, local and international, they push us out of the comfort zone. So, I mean, it really is challenging, and it's about perhaps tapping into the agents of change, because all communities will have agents of change, and it's tapping into these agents of change. But it's not easy, because they're not always as acceptable by the communities themselves. So,
I always think of my home environment in Australia, and certainly when I was growing up, and I had very little awareness of the international community, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and I'd say most of the UK, most of Australia, and most people don't. And you know, to expect a community to want to have that kind of awareness and to want that kind of engagement isn't necessarily a realistic thing. And I think sometimes we go into these communities expecting them to want to have the sophistication and that level of engagement where it's not realistic. And not only is it not realistic, it's sort of the old statement where we don't talk about peace in Australia because we don't have conflict. And so the actual presence of international agencies is recognition that the family laws and safety nets, the community laws and rules and safety nets, and the national rules and safety nets that act to protect an individual have broken down to the extent that you have international camps being set up, that you have international law being applied. And so where you're trying to rebuild or you're trying to work with a community to rebuild their protective safety nets and their protective rules and laws, you actually, you know, to some degree, you don't necessarily need to be looking at that stuff. You know, like UNHCR has its mission and mandate, and they'll find local people that are interested in this level of debate and this level of engagement. So will other international agencies that have missions and mandates that act on that international level. ActionAid itself, you know, it says very, very clearly in its mission and its objectives that it aims to partner with communities. And so when we talk about partnering with communities, we're not talking about partnering with those communities so that they can actively lobby and engage with international human rights law. We're talking with them so that they can start to rebuild the laws that protect their children, the rules that act on them, that they care about on a daily basis. And some of those relate to cultural issues, some of those relate to family issues, and so there is that linkage, but they don't, like, the Geneva Declaration doesn't mean very much to an individual in a conflict situation, right? And so that's not what ActionAid's here to do. There are other agencies here to do that, and they will find people to work with them, but that's, we don't need to be talking about that stuff at a family level or a community level.
Just to quickly follow up, I think part of what I was also trying to get at is not necessarily at the level of sort of law, Geneva Convention, any of that, but partly even just at that sort of local/regional level of connecting with the officials who, who do have an impact on their lives in a very daily way.
Sure.
And if we're looking at moving them not just from being recipients or sort of being effective to being actors in their own right to promoting their own protection, that does have impacts on some of those official structures that impact on their lives.
I guess the key thing that ActionAid does is try to set up a relationship or an example that can be used in other ways. And so a lot of this is the bottom-up accountability that we have to our communities in terms of telling them what our budget is, telling them what our objectives are, telling them what we're doing on a daily basis, and then asking them to question us about where's that money going, what are you guys doing? And so through the process of empowering communities or responsibilising communities to seek accountability from us, we hope, and we have seen in programs in different countries in the world where that has blossomed, so that they're actually asking for that accountability from their stakeholders, from their local government officials or whoever they may be.
But is that something that you would, in your programming, actively sort of encourage, or it happens sort of, as you said, organically?
Look, some programs encourage. I guess at the moment we're not. At the moment it's still a new thing. It's still a brand new thing, and so it's working on them to seek it from us. And then I guess once that's happening effectively, once I see that happening effectively, then we'll start to talk about them. Okay, so what about this dam? What about this? Those sort of local processes.
Yes, because I think some NGOs do look at working with communities in that way, in a similar way to ActionAid's approach, but it's about building constituencies of support and also looking at, helping them also to identify who is responsible at different levels, because communities can't do... Exactly. We've already said that there are limitations also to communities' experience and knowledge in terms of who should be accountable to them. Yeah,
and look, quite often we're partnering with the community and with the local municipality, and so part of our partnership with the municipality is getting the municipality to release all this information and sort of say to them, we won't be partnering with you if you're not going to use these funds transparently, and i.e. what we mean by that is telling the community, telling your constituents how this money is being spent, because ultimately it's the donors' money, it's our money, and it's not for the municipality, it's for the community.
More questions? Yes, and then we've got another one on online. Go ahead. Please, your name.
Okay, thanks. I'm Sarah Lilly. I'm from Save the Children. Thanks very much for this presentation. At Save the Children, we've been doing a lot of work in the last year on learning about community-based child protection mechanisms particularly. So this is really relevant for us and also resonates a lot with the findings that we're coming across. I just wanted to ask particularly around the issue of assessment and building on what exists, and issues around the process and the length of time required to do effective work with community-based protection and child protection for us. One of the things that we've been learning in our review of our own work and other agencies is that often we're not actually building on what already exists at the community. We're not really fully assessing what's there and taking the time to understand how communities are having their own mechanisms and structures. And this is partly around, when you look from the outside, it might look like there's nothing there and it's unstructured, but you don't actually know as an outsider, and you don't know until you really dig deep and find out. And then from there, the process of once you might understand what's going on, the length of time required to really work closely with communities and support what exists already. And that's something I think that through our review we've found we're not really doing particularly well in humanitarian contexts, but also in development contexts, even though we tend to have longer time periods and funding windows. So I just wondered if you, from this review, whether there have been any really good examples that we can draw on about where anyone has done some good, thorough assessments and really worked with communities to understand what's there, and if there are tools that you've come across, or if there are some in this toolkit, which we can look at across different areas of child protection.
The manual has a bunch of tools, but I'm not going to talk about the manual. I'll talk about a process that we've just gone through, and like Save the Children. Look, we've got a very understanding donor in the Australian government working with us in the West Bank, and they've given us a 5-year funding agreement for working with 17 communities in the West Bank. And we, the degree of flexibility is such that they allowed us 6 months in the first year to get to know the communities we're working with. We'd already done sort of a year and a half identifying the communities and identifying where we were going to work and prioritising this. And look, I can share with you the strategic planning documents. The first step in our process, well, there's 2 steps really. First step was to do the strategic planning and the capacity assessments of these community-based organisations. We'd identified 2 community-based organisations in each of these communities to work with based on the assessments that we'd already done. The strategic planning process that we went through exceeded all of our expectations in terms of the information we received from the community, and also in terms of the degree of ownership that they took over the strategic plans. None of these communities had ever done a strategic planning process before, and they, working in the West Bank, which has had year in, year out humanitarian funding for the last 50-odd years, most of the donors that had come to them had more or less come to them with their latest funding priorities and said, are you able to do a particular project in a particular sector? And of course they say yes, and they do it. And so they've got 20 years doing this and that and swapping all over the place. We went to them and we said, okay, like I was talking about before, you know, what inspires you? What's your community? Why do you exist as a community-based organisation? Just getting the answer to that question took us weeks, you know. But because we'd gone to them and said, okay, we're here for 5 years. We're here to work with you for 5 years, and we've got funding to back that up for 5 years. They were prepared to go on this journey with us. They were prepared to talk to us. And I'm sure most of you have been through a strategic planning process, and they can be real catfights, you know, like people in the organisation have one particular objective. We all are very, very passionate about the work we're doing, about the objectives, about the change we're trying to see in the world. And there's no different in the community-based organisations, but it doesn't often come to the surface. Or else it'll be one charismatic leader in the community. You bring the whole board together, you bring the whole General Assembly together, you make them all buy into this process, and the fights and the arguments and the tears, and it was quite overwhelming. But at the end of it, what we actually had from these communities was a real trust and a real respect and a real willingness to I don't know, a real enthusiasm to meet their own objectives, and because we had this commitment and because we were there to work with them, they actually saw that it was possible, which they'd never seen before with the other donors. So I can share you the strategic planning process, but I think that was the thing for us. It's right from the word go, you know, when we're going into a community and working with them, saying, okay, we're committed to stay here, we want to be your friends, we want to, you know, and we'd like to see some change, but unless you can tell us what that change is, then we're not going to, what's the point, you know? And so taking that step by step, and I've got a great quote, I didn't bring the slide, but one woman working in Karas, she said, we feel like an unconscious baby who has, our organisation feels like our organisation feels like a baby in a coma that's just woken up, you know, and this organisation have been working for 20 years, you know, Another quote that we had from one community was, we know that whenever ActionAid is going to do a workshop with us, it's going to be really, really tiring, but really exciting as well, you know, and it's true, you know, like, but look, to be honest, all the tools in the world don't make a bit of difference if you're not prepared to build the relationship and you don't have staff that are committed to building that relationship. And I've got projects where perhaps the commitment's not necessarily there from the staff, and it doesn't matter what we say or what tools we give them, it's the same result, you know. So it's sort of, it's that relationship, it boils down to relationship. It's about social change, you know, social change. It's not about economic development, it's not about anything else, and social change only comes through, you know, a degree of love and respect between two people.
I think we had one online, and then can we take yours? Okay.
We actually have 3
Oh,
online.
3, okay.
Can I give you all of them?
Right, we've got plenty of time, if that's okay.
Okay. Nicholas Meller, who's researching with the OU based in the UK, asks, could either of the speakers reflect on the role or education programmes have in promoting protection of children? The premise is that schools in the community are in a position to play a more proactive role in promoting protection, and yet education is often not prioritised in humanitarian programmes. Rachel Hasty from Oxfam, who's in Oxford at the moment, says, we try to hold duty bearers to account and simultaneously support community protection strategies. One of the problems we face is that CBOs can sometimes be discriminatory, exclusive and divisive. Then we are faced with working with them because they exist and have credibility, or try to change them. What has been ActionAid's experience of this? And Tommaso Gazzetti, who's in Italy, says, what do you think is the best way to draw the attention of donors to local NGOs that implements innovative community-based projects like those 9 NGOs in Gaza that were mentioned before?
Could you repeat that one for me? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. What do you think is the best way to draw the attention of the donors to local NGOs that implement innovative community-based projects like those 9 NGOs in Gaza that were mentioned before?
I'll answer that question first because that's the easiest one for me.
Yes, that'll keep you busy for a while.
No, look, that question is one that we're addressing at the moment. I guess doing things like this, like really, it's difficult. Gaza is difficult for a whole range of reasons, and trying to get funds for any kind of work in Gaza at the moment is extremely political and extremely difficult. I guess donors are no different to the directors of our own organisations and people we work with, and I think they're inspired by good ideas as well. And that's been the case with this particular project and this particular idea. Everybody I've spoken to about it, donors and other NGOs and other INGOs alike, have all liked the idea and have been inspired by it. But getting funds for it requires some system change, you know, because a 12-month funding cycle isn't going to have a lot of impact in a project like that. But nobody's putting more than 12 months worth of funding into Gaza at the moment, except for particular donors who we're not too concerned about working with. Sorry.
Did you want to add anything?
Not to that question.
Okay.
So the question, do you want to go next?
Rachel, thank you for the question. Yeah, well, it is difficult, and that's one of the challenges that we mentioned about the communities, and CBOs can be divisive, and also there are community-based organizations that do not, share the same world view. So there are community-based organizations that do not necessarily share the same values that, for example, ActionAid or another organization represent and uphold. And it really is a tough question. Do we work with them just because they exist? I don't think I have a yes or no answer, but I guess it requires a lot of analysis and soul searching. And what came up from the research that we've just finished in Pakistan is that communities themselves actually told us that they would respect more organizations who refuse to work with community-based organizations because they don't see eye to eye with them and were vocal about it and upfront about it than compromise their principles and work with, and the example in the Pakistan was the Taliban, and work with the Taliban just to reach us with food and assistance. And this came constantly from communities that, no, we would respect you more and we would value more that you were able to take this position because they're causing us more trouble. So it really depends on the dynamics, and I'm using the word very broadly, politics of the organization, and also on the humanitarian context, because humanitarian contexts are extremely different. We cannot, I think, compare the situation in Gaza with the situation in Haiti, for example, and the historical relationship between people in Gaza, Palestine, the whole Middle East, to an international community that in their perceptions is Western and American and Americanized, to a situation in Haiti where it is, to start with, a natural disaster and not a conflict, and we're all more chums and trying to help one another on a humanitarian basis. So huge difference. And again, to what extent, as Brendan says, the organization is placing its humanitarian assistance as part of its role in social change, that I'm not here to do humanitarian assistance, period. We're doing humanitarian assistance as part of social change, and we're willing to pay the price for that in terms of who we engage with, in terms of community-based organizations and the kind of tensions that we know we might create in the community. So that's for this question. And then there is the question by Nicholas. But Brendan, do you want to say anything around Rachel's question around duty bearers and community-based organizations?
Yeah, really. I mean, that's a similar answer. To me, it's the relationships and the staff you have on the ground, because if you don't have that respect, like there's a great example that one of my colleagues shared with me only a couple of weeks ago, where they were able to establish a degree of respect and trust between the community-based organisation and the staff member that I'm talking about. And he became aware of a particular situation, call it corruption, or it was an unethical event that happened, and he was able to raise it openly and transparently with the organisation, with the board, in front of the particular person who was involved. So it was a degree of loss of face and shame, and it changed everything. And this person, it didn't result in the person leaving the organisation or having to leave the organisation. They made amends for the situation, and the organisation has been incredibly strong ever since. And so I think it's one of those cases where you can turn a negative into a positive. So it's not always about dropping the partner organisation. Of course, sometimes this needs to happen. It's about pulling the organisation back to their stated principles and their stated goals and objectives and reason for being.
Yeah, so just the
education.
acknowledging the
Yes, that's
question
right,
on education. Gosh, I wish I had a magical answer, but I don't, as always, never do on anything. But again, I would say my reflection on this is that the role of education in a humanitarian assistance, it also depends on the kind of humanitarian assistance, but if it is boom, 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 let's go in with the humanitarian package, food, non-food items, and who has time for education? And perhaps the role of education will differ in its impact, and not its importance, but its impact, when from sudden onset emergency, that it is emergency and organizations are going in and out, than when it is a long protracted humanitarian situation like the Gaza or Darfur, for example. As I said, I'm not really a protection specialist, so I do not have a lot of neither experience nor knowledge about contexts where education played a positive impact, as in actually in terms of protection. I don't know if you have any examples of that, Brendan, or any of the participants.
Yeah, look, the animation project I mentioned before was in actual fact implemented through the schools. It had to be implemented through the schools, and it's been so successful that schools are asking them to return and come back time and time again, because they're seeing the impacts in terms of the children's attention in non-creative classes, mathematics, English, Arabic, and so forth. And so that's one protection program that is offering the children something above and beyond the curriculum, which inspires children and has this ripple effect throughout their lives. So that's one excellent program. But I mean, looking at the broader case, a lot of the protection issues we see in the Middle East, a lot of them are occurring in schools. There's violence between teachers and students, between students, and so it is a huge issue. And I'm not well placed to talk about how you deal with those issues.
I can say a little something on this just because I spent quite a long time working with Save the Children UK myself and in southern Sudan, where we had a very closely linked education and protection program. And I think that the way that we looked at it, and there's been quite a lot written on the links between education and protection, which are available online through Save the Children. The Humanitarian Practice Network has done some work on this. And there are other resources, the Emergency Education Network, lots of different places where you can find this information. But in terms of practical examples, I think Southern Sudan is a good case where you had a protracted civil war. You had situations where, indeed, funding for education was very difficult to come by until probably about 2000, 2001. And that was, again, a case of, like what we're doing today, disseminating information about how those links can be made, about how if children have a routine, if they can go to school, it protects them even from recruitment, by military groups, because they're seen to be involved in something. It gives them a structure to their lives. There were children's groups also that were formed that worked in those schools, and we had a whole set of different structures, which I think really formalized those links. And that community protection program that we also worked on there with groups there, and I think this may be one of the things that Save the Children must be evaluating as well. I mean, there were a lot of strengths to that program as well, and it's being replicated throughout the country. I think there were also a number of weaknesses, because I don't think that we had sufficient time to really get to know the people that we were working with. It's a situation also, and I don't know if it's the same in Gaza, where you're in and out. If there are attacks, people were pulled out. You had local staff who would remain, but sometimes the connections were not as strong as they could have been. And that disrupts and affects the quality of your relationships with communities and with the actors that you're working with. So we can... I think it was Nicholas who wrote that. You're probably aware of those resources, but if you're not, please do send us an email, and we can make sure that you get a hold of some of those resources that might help. You had a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Nisa Al-Mali. Thank you. I work as a policy advisor, but I'm interested in this because I spent some time last year in the West Bank visiting local NGOs, and I also used to live in Egypt and spent some time living with Nubian villagers. And my question is quite specific, Amani. It's about UNDP and how well you think they engage with local communities and local NGOs.
Where?
In Egypt, but you were part of putting the gender in UNDP, which is
I feel slightly awkward commenting on my previous employer when I'm with the new employer. But I think generally the way UNDP worked, it did not work directly with local NGOs. It worked through the Social Fund for Development, and most of the countries that took up the particular structural adjustment package post-1996 had this very interesting melange where UNDP was actually operating. So it was UNDP, Social Fund for Development, and the Prime Minister office, and they were all this semi-governmental body. So they worked through what were called the social funds for development, and these then channeled through 5 programs working with local and community-based organizations. And again, but that was a development context, of course, not a humanitarian context. But a lot of the problems of funding cycles, trends, were very evident. Were very evident there, and I suppose in terms of actual engagement in the context of Egypt, when I was there, it was not as we would consider it really adequate now. But also that was a different decade and a different context. I'm not saying this to be complacent or to be apologetic for any organization, but it was a different context. And also one of the, and this is more a general point and linking to your point, Brendan, about, well, community organizations themselves are not always expecting. So, the idea that there is a lot of resistance from community-based organizations and national NGOs. And like with my previous job with Rainbow, we worked exclusively with community-based organizations and national NGOs. And we spent a lot of energy, money, and resources with community. And we had long-term, 10 years engagement with community-based organizations across Africa. And you'd be surprised that a lot of the resistance we faced were from these community-based organizations and national NGOs who were very used to developing the proposals in a very specific format. So you'll be there, you'll spend 3 months in a village with them, getting the needs assessment, and then the proposal will come back saying something like, I don't know, training workshops on the awareness on female genital mutilation. They're aware. They've actually told us, that they're aware. We don't need, and T-shirts. We're against FGM. No. But these came from the community-based organizations who very strangely spent with us the 3 months with the village, hearing them saying we need a health center for sexual and reproductive health and rights. They wanted to stop they're aware. They're very aware. Thank you very much. So, yeah.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hi. I'm Alison from Save the Children. I'm working on the same kind of paper and research area that Sarah was talking about around community-based child protection mechanisms. Particularly, we're looking in emergencies. I wonder what Brendan's opinions were of kind of suitable roles of community-based protection groups or mechanisms or CBOs. I mean, there's a variety we've seen through the paper that we're writing, a whole variety and at different approaches of how they're set up, agency-led, looking more at using what's already existing. But in terms of some of the trickier roles that communities can play around identification and support of particularly vulnerable cases or kind of referral through what support systems might be available. That's something I think a lot of agencies are grappling with, particularly in emergencies when the situation is quite unclear and there might not be the referral services that we would like in place.
For children?
For children or women, vulnerable groups just in general. I mean, it's kind of similar issues, really.
Let me just see if I've got the question right. So what would the role of the CBOs be in supporting the referral systems and the
what do you think is suitable?
Yeah.
Just in terms of your own personal kind of experience
Can I say I recommend you get in touch with a consultant who is working with DFID in Gaza. Her name is Mary Jennings. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's UK based, I believe, because I know she was doing a lot of work on this in Gaza. I don't know if I've got much to add, to be honest. for referral systems to work effectively, you've got to have somewhere to refer people. And one of the big problems in Gaza is that there aren't enough organisations providing particularly high-quality one-on-one psychological support for these cases that need more intensive care. And that's a big issue. It's a big issue we face through this animation project as well, because obviously a lot comes to the surface there. The role that CBOs can play, I don't know. I think it would be dictated a lot by the CBOs in question. You know, some of them, try to extend their mandate too far, and then they can add more harm by trying to address some of these issues in an unprofessional way. But yeah, I don't know. I'm really talking out of my bottom.
Did you have some examples that, or
No, we've seen through the paper that some will go straight into, with very little training or support or experience, go straight into identifying and then referring up very technical cases of maybe GBV, gender-based violence or abuse within schools, and it's kind of working out. We've got the paper that we're writing is for the Child Protection Working Group, so we're trying to work out kind of like recommendations about what are appropriate roles. Should community-based mechanisms in an emergency with very short timeframes of project implementation, 6 months, 12 months funding, should they really be kind of getting involved in all of these quite technical, personal cases that can do more harm than good if they're not being dealt with properly or when there are limited services? So I think it's just quite a lot of similar issues that everybody's grappling with, and it's kind of working out where the boundaries are and how you support, because with agencies have different approaches, so maybe the approach to action would be slightly different for some, but just a lot of interesting stuff out there, some good, some not so good.
Yeah, look, I've got to say, from our perspective as an NGO working in Gaza, we don't have that expertise ourselves, and so we work with a partner, a very, very strong partner, Gaza Community Mental Health Program. But just about every agency in Gaza is working with this same organisation, you know?
I did quite a lot of work on OPC, and also everybody's using the same organisations, because capacity is quite limited, and going to the same, and then that stretches further, and how much can we expect people to expand in an emergency? And in that particular scenario, bringing new expertise in is near impossible, local expertise. So talk to Mary Jennings, because she went to Gaza, did a lot of research on this kind of stuff, I think.
Good. Anybody else? It's 12 now, although we're going to be moving over next door, is that right, Kat, for sandwiches in a minute. But anything else online? No? Any other comments or questions, observations? Just to reiterate that we've got copies of the network paper and the manual outside. We've also got, we just published at the same time as the network paper, Humanitarian Exchange number 47, which is also focused on protection. So that's the theme of the issue. So there are a number of articles in that issue also that deal with community-based protection programs in different contexts, as well as the usual policy and practice notes. And we have many papers out here also written by HPG researchers looking at different aspects of protection and livelihoods, amongst others. I think, Sarah, your paper on the OPT also, and what's the title of that?
That was Losing Ground, examining the linkages between livelihoods and protections in the OPT, both looking at the West Bank and Gaza.
And that was published quite recently too, wasn't it? Beginning of the year?
1 year ago.
1 year ago, okay. But there are many copies of that also on the table, so do help yourselves, and we hope that you'll join us over here for sandwiches and some more networking. And thank you again to all of those who joined us online, and your questions were really insightful. And thanks to Brendan and Amani. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I just add, if people have other questions, both Kate and Cheryl's email addresses are in the front of the manual. Better ask them than me.
Yeah. I think you did very well. No, thanks to everyone for attending today.